I still remember the sound of his laughter. Not the kind that warms a room, but the kind that cuts through your chest, reminding you exactly how small someone thinks you are. That morning felt ordinary. The office smelled like burnt coffee and cheap perfume, printers humming in the background, keyboards clicking in uneven rhythm. I had worked there for 5 years, 5 long, loyal years, and not once did I imagine that my final day would start with something as simple as a laugh. His laugh. Mr. Harrison, the man who thought he owned not just the company, but the people inside it. To him, we weren't employees. We were tools, replaceable, mechanical, and silent. When I joined, I was 25, young, determined, full of hope. I believed hard work spoke louder than titles. I stayed late, skipped lunches, and sacrificed weekends to make deadlines happen. I handled his presentations, fixed his mistakes, even covered for him when he forgot meetings. He used to say, "You're a good one, Anna. You make my life easier." I used to take that as praise. But now I know, it was a warning. Because the moment you make a narcissist's life easier, you stop being a person to them and become property. It started small, like most betrayals do. A few missing credits on reports I had written. Then, ideas I pitched showing up in board meetings, only now they were his. Still, I stayed quiet. Because that's what you do when you think loyalty will eventually be rewarded. But reward never came. Only expectations. And when I finally asked for a raise, a simple, reasonable raise, he leaned back in his leather chair, smirked, and said, "Anna, you should be grateful you even have this job. Women your age usually get distracted, families, emotions, drama. You're lucky I keep you here." That sentence stayed with me. Not because of the insult, but because of the certainty in his tone. He really believed it. I went home that night, sat on my kitchen floor with my laptop, and stared at my resume. I hadn't updated it in years. It felt like trying to remember who I was before this place. Before him. Weeks passed. The office kept spinning, projects kept coming, and Mr. Harrison kept taking credit for everything I did. Then came the final straw, the annual presentation. The one that decides who gets promoted. I worked on it for 3 months, late nights, early mornings, fixing slides until my eyes burned. It was my masterpiece. My chance. And on the day of the meeting, I sat proudly at the side, watching as Mr. Harrison presented my work to the board, my research, my strategy, my design, and ended his speech with, "I couldn't have done it without my team, of course." No names. No mention. Just that same fake smile. They applauded. He took a bow. And I sat there, clapping too, but something inside me broke quietly. That was the day I decided to leave. The plan formed slowly, carefully. I wasn't going to shout, or cry, or give him the satisfaction of watching me crumble. No. When I left, he was going to feel it. For 2 weeks, I prepared. I moved files, saved backups, and gathered every document that proved how much work I had done, and how much he had stolen. Every project. Every report. Every late-night email he sent me with "fix this before morning" written like a command. I created a folder, Truth. Inside it was everything, evidence, emails, reports, all with timestamps and signatures. It wasn't revenge yet. It was truth waiting to be seen. But revenge was coming. The morning I decided to walk out, the office was quiet. He was in his glass room, on a call, laughing, the same arrogant laugh I'd learned to recognize. I took one last look around, my desk, the coffee stains, the stack of files. I opened my drawer, pulled out an envelope, and placed it neatly in the center of his desk. No note, no label, just that envelope. Inside was the one thing he never expected. It wasn't money. It wasn't resignation. It was something far more powerful and far more permanent. As I walked toward the elevator, heels clicking softly against the tiles, I heard him call out. Anna. Where are you going? The report's due in an hour. I turned slightly, just enough for him to see my face through the glass wall. And I smiled. Not politely. Not submissively. But the kind of smile that says, you'll remember this moment forever. He laughed again, waving his hand dismissively. Oh, don't tell me you're quitting. You'll be back by Monday. I didn't reply. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, heart steady, mind clear. When those doors closed, I exhaled, years of silence leaving my chest in one long breath. The elevator doors closed behind me with a quiet hum, sealing years of exhaustion inside that building. I didn't cry. I didn't even look back. Sometimes, endings don't explode, they exhale. I walked out into the morning light. The city felt louder, sharper, almost too alive. For the first time in years, I was outside at 9 a.m. with no rush, no deadlines, no fake smiles. Freedom felt heavy at first, like a coat I hadn't worn in too long. I found a small cafe 2 blocks away, ordered black coffee, and sat by the window. From there, I could still see the building, tall, of glass, cold. Somewhere on the 10th floor, Mr. Harrison was about to find my envelope. Inside that envelope was not a letter. It wasn't even an explanation. It was proof. Everything he had ever stolen. Every email where I was just assisting, every slide deck where my name was quietly removed, every credit that was shifted his way. And on top of all of it, one page. A summary addressed to the board of directors, with a single sentence. Transparency builds trust, perhaps it's time this company saw who really built it. I had BCC'd every member of the board before I left. All the files were already in their inboxes, time-stamped and verified. By the time he'd tear open the envelope, he'd already be receiving the notifications on his screen. I could almost imagine his face. The confusion. The disbelief. The anger. The moment his world started cracking, not loudly, but quietly, from the inside. At 9:42 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a message from Claire, a coworker, one of the few who had stayed kind even when others turned cold. Claire, Anna, what did you do? Harrison just called an emergency meeting. Half the board's in shock. I smiled into my cup. The first real smile in a long time. Me, just told the truth. There was a pause. Then she replied. Claire, you're a legend. An hour later, another message. Claire, they suspended him. HR's auditing everything. They're calling you in to verify. For a second, I froze. Not out of fear, but out of disbelief that something I'd quietly dreamed of was actually happening. For years, I'd accepted his control, believed his words that I was nothing without him. And now, without even raising my voice, I had undone everything he built on my back. That afternoon, the company's statement went out. Due to ongoing internal review regarding leadership conduct and project attribution, Mr. Harrison has been temporarily relieved of duty. My phone didn't stop buzzing for hours. Old coworkers. Clients. Even people from other departments. All with the same message. We finally see it now. Some even apologized. But I didn't need apologies. What I needed was peace. By evening, I was home, sitting on my balcony, the city lights blinking like quiet stars below. The air smelled like rain, and for the first time in years, I breathed deeply. Then, another call came, this time from an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Anna, the voice said. It was him. Harrison. He didn't sound like the man I knew. The arrogance was gone. He sounded smaller. "You destroyed me," he said quietly. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I let the silence stretch. Then I said, calmly, "You destroyed yourself. I just stopped helping you hide it." He didn't reply at first. I could hear him breathing, trying to find words that would still make him sound powerful. But there were none left. "You'll regret this," he finally said, voice trembling. I smiled softly. "No, Mr. Harrison. You will." And I hung up. That night, I didn't sleep much, not because of guilt, but because of the strange stillness that follows a storm. I lay in bed thinking about how many women like me were still trapped in offices like that, silenced, underestimated, used. I thought about how many times I'd almost given up, how many times I told myself, it's not worth the fight. But it was. It always is. Because sometimes, walking away isn't weakness. It's the loudest way of saying, you don't own me anymore. 2 weeks later, I received an email. Subject, new opportunity. It was from one of the board members, a woman who had quietly watched Harrison's rise over the years. She wanted me to return. Not as his assistant. As a project director. Her message ended with, "Sometimes truth takes time to find its voice. You gave it one." I stared at the screen, tears in my eyes, not from sadness, but relief. The kind of relief that feels like finally coming home to yourself. Now, when I pass that building, I don't feel bitterness. I feel gratitude. Because that was where I learned one of life's hardest lessons. You can give your best to the wrong person, but it's never wasted. It becomes the strength you'll use to build your next chapter. And as for Mr. Harrison, he's no longer there. His office is empty, his nameplate removed, his laughter gone. But sometimes, I imagine him finding my envelope again, that white paper with quiet fury folded inside. And maybe, just maybe, he finally understands that the woman he underestimated was the one holding up his entire empire all along. The weeks that followed felt strange, quiet, yet full of new sounds. The sound of my own thoughts. The clinking of coffee cups at cafes I'd never had time to visit. The sound of peace. For years, my mornings had been mechanical, rushing, pretending, surviving. Now, I woke up to sunlight spilling across my floor, soft and golden, like forgiveness. At first, I didn't know what to do with so much silence. No deadlines. No meetings. No voice reminding me that I was replaceable. Just me. And the realization that I'd finally gotten my life back. But healing isn't instant. It's slow. It's walking through memories that still sting but hurt a little less each time. Some mornings, I'd wake up panicking, reaching for my phone, expecting angry emails. Then I'd remember, there was no one left to control me anymore. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done since college. Every night before bed, I wrote one truth about my day. Some days it was small. I drank tea and watched the rain. Some days, it was heavier. I'm still angry, but I don't hate him anymore. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk, my own desk, in my own apartment, an email arrived. It was from Margaret Shaw, one of the board directors from my old company. She'd heard about what happened, the investigation, the suspension, the quiet storm that had swept through the upper floors. "Anna," she wrote. "We're restructuring leadership and I'd like to meet. Not to talk about the past, but the future." Her words made me pause. For a long time, the future had felt like a door I wasn't allowed to open. Now it was opening by itself. The meeting was scheduled for Monday, 10 a.m. Same city, new energy. When I arrived, the receptionist smiled. She recognized me, but not as Harrison's assistant. She said, "You're Anna, right? The one who exposed him?" Her tone wasn't judgment. It was admiration. That moment, that one small sentence, felt like years of silence breaking. Margaret greeted me with warmth that didn't need words. She was in her late 50s, graceful, calm, the kind of woman who carried power without ever raising her voice. "Anna," she said, "you did something most people are too afraid to do. You walked away with dignity." I smiled, a little shyly. It didn't feel dignified at the time. "That's how truth always feels at first," she replied softly. Then she slid a file across the table. Project Director, Innovation and Internal Development. Salary, triple what I used to make. Position, independent. Answerable only to the board. For a moment, I couldn't speak. All those nights of staying late, of holding my tongue, of crying quietly in restroom stalls, they suddenly made sense. Margaret looked at me and said, "You've already proven what integrity looks like under pressure. Now show us what it looks like in power." I nodded slowly. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was starting over. I felt like I was finally arriving. The first day in my new office, I stood by the window and looked out at the city skyline. From up here, it didn't look intimidating anymore. It looked like opportunity. I placed a small photo frame on my desk, not of family, not of friends. Just a simple quote I'd written myself. "Don't prove them wrong. Prove yourself right." Days turned into weeks, and I poured my heart into the work. Not to impress anyone, but because I loved it again. That was something I hadn't felt in years. My team respected me, not because I demanded it, but because I listened. Every woman on my team had a voice. Every idea was credited. Every effort acknowledged. And slowly, I realized, revenge hadn't just been about making him fall. It was about rebuilding the system he'd tried to control. Then, one day, news broke quietly in the industry. Former executive Harrison under review for multiple misconduct violations. He'd tried joining another firm, but his record followed him. Every time he applied, my report surfaced, official, documented, undeniable. He'd become a ghost of his former self, still breathing, but forgotten by the world that once praised him. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post about it. I just closed the article and whispered to myself, "I forgive you. But I'll never forget what you taught me." Because forgiveness, I learned, isn't for them. It's for the peace you owe yourself. A year later, at a leadership conference, I gave a talk titled, "Walking Away Isn't Weakness." I told my story, not to shame anyone, but to remind every woman listening that silence is never loyalty. That courage isn't always loud, sometimes it's just standing up and walking out the door that was never meant to keep you. When I finished, the room was silent. Then one woman in the back stood up and clapped. Then another. And another. Until the whole hall was filled with the sound of hands that understood. After the talk, a young intern came up to me. Her eyes were shining. She said, "I was thinking of quitting my job today. My boss keeps taking credit for my work. But after hearing you, I'm going to speak up instead." I smiled and touched her hand gently. "That's the power of one truth," I told her. "It doesn't just free you. It gives others permission to be free too." That night, as I walked back to my car, I passed a small reflection in a building window of me, but different. Calmer. Wiser. Lighter. And I thought, maybe life doesn't punish us with endings. Maybe it rewards us with new beginnings disguised as heartbreak. Because sometimes, the sweetest revenge isn't watching someone lose. It's watching yourself win quietly. With grace, strength, and a smile that says, "You thought I was gone, but I was just getting started." It had been almost 2 years since I'd walked out of that office. 2 years since I'd left behind the noise, the fear, and the man who once thought he owned my silence. Life had become quieter, fuller. My new role had taken me places I never imagined: conferences, new partnerships, mentoring programs for young women who wanted to rise without losing themselves. I no longer chased validation. I created it. But fate has a strange sense of timing. It waits until you're finally steady, then whispers, "Let's see how far you've truly come." It was a Thursday morning when my assistant, Jenna, walked into my office. She had that cautious look on her face, the one people wear when they're not sure how you'll react. "Anna," she said gently, "there's a new collaboration proposal from Easton and Marks." She hesitated. Then added, "Their new senior consultant is Richard Harrison." I froze for a heartbeat. Not because I was scared, but because his name sounded like a ghost I'd buried long ago. I looked at her calmly and said, "Schedule the meeting." Jenna blinked. "Are you sure?" I smiled, a small, quiet smile. "Completely." The following week, he walked into my conference room. Same confident stride. Same expensive suit. But something was different. His eyes. They no longer had that careless gleam, the one that used to make people feel small just to make him look taller. Now they carried the weight of something heavier. Regret. He saw me, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. "Anna," he said finally, voice low. "It's been a long time." I stood, extended my hand. "Mr. Harrison. Welcome." He looked at me, really looked. The nameplate on my desk said Anna Wells, Director of Strategic Development. He swallowed hard before sitting down. For the first 15 minutes, the meeting was polite, professional. Numbers, timelines, projections, nothing personal. But every now and then, his eyes would drift, studying me as if trying to recognize the woman he once dismissed. Halfway through, he finally said, "You've done well for yourself." I met his gaze, steady. "I did what you always said I couldn't." He flinched slightly, not because I said it harshly, but because I said it without hate. That was when I realized something. The real power wasn't in humiliating him. It was in being so at peace that he couldn't touch me anymore. After the meeting, as we walked out, he lingered by the door. "Anna, I owe you an apology." The room went still. Even Jenna, who was gathering notes, froze. He continued, voice softer. "You didn't deserve the way I treated you. I was arrogant. And afraid." I tilted my head slightly. "Afraid?" He nodded slowly. "Because you were better. And I couldn't handle it." For the first time, I saw not the man who'd laughed at me, but the broken one behind the laughter. I could have said so many things. I could have reminded him of the nights I cried, the dreams he stole, the career he nearly ended. But instead, I simply said, "I accept your apology. But I moved on a long time ago." He nodded. There was sadness in his eyes, but also relief. As he turned to leave, I added quietly, "For what it's worth, Richard, thank you." He stopped, confused. "For what?" "For teaching me that losing everything isn't the end, it's just how you start again." He smiled faintly, a smile that belonged to someone who finally understood what power really looked like. Then he walked away. That evening, I stood by my window again, the same way I had years ago after walking out of his office for the last time. The city below shimmered with life. And I realized something beautiful. The past doesn't disappear when you heal. It just stops hurting. Weeks later, our collaboration went through. His firm handled the logistics, mine the creative side. Everything stayed professional, distant, clean, complete. But every now and then, I'd receive an email from him, always short, always respectful. Once, at the end of a successful campaign, he wrote, "You were always the smartest person in the room. I just wish I'd realized it sooner." I didn't reply. Some stories don't need sequels. Some are perfect the moment you decide to end them with grace. Months passed. My company grew stronger, my influence wider. I was invited to speak at a global leadership forum in London, the kind of stage I used to dream about while taking notes in the shadows. As I stood before the audience, I said, "Once upon a time, I worked for someone who told me I was too emotional to lead. But emotion is what makes leadership human. And empathy, not ego, is what builds legacies." The crowd stood and applauded. And somewhere deep inside, the last pieces of my old self, the hurt, the doubt, the fear, finally fell silent. Because sometimes revenge isn't an act. It's an evolution. And the sweetest revenge of all is walking back into the same room that once broke you. As the woman they can't stop respecting. It's strange how time moves differently once you make peace with your past. Days don't rush anymore. You stop counting the hours. You start living them. It had been 3 years since that final meeting with Richard Harrison. 3 years since I had looked into the eyes of the man who once defined my limits, and realized he no longer could. Life had changed quietly, not with fireworks, but with calm certainty. My work had grown beyond the company walls. I'd started mentoring women who felt voiceless in their careers, women who reminded me of who I once was. Some came broken. Some came brave. All left stronger. And every time I heard one of them say, "I finally stood up for myself," I smiled, because that was the real legacy I wanted to leave behind. One crisp autumn morning, I was walking through the city park, the same one I used to cross during my old commutes. The air smelled like rain and distant coffee, a scent that somehow felt like nostalgia and freedom blended together. As I sat on a bench under a canopy of golden leaves, a man's voice called softly, "Anna?" I turned. And there he was. Richard Harrison. Older. Thinner. The confidence that once filled every inch of him had faded, replaced by something quieter. He smiled, awkwardly. "Didn't think I'd run into you here." I nodded politely. Life has a funny sense of direction. He chuckled softly. "Yeah. It does." He sat down beside me, leaving a respectful space. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Just the wind rustling through leaves, nature's way of filling silence when words aren't enough. Finally, he said, "I heard about your foundation. The mentorship program." I looked at him, curious. "You keep up with what I do?" He shrugged slightly. "It's hard not to. You're everywhere now. Articles, interviews, they even quoted one of your talks at my firm last month." There was no jealousy in his voice this time. Just quiet admiration, the kind that doesn't demand anything back. He sighed. "You were right, you know. About everything." I said nothing. Sometimes silence is the kindest response. He continued. "After I lost the company, I tried starting over. Failed twice. But it was the best thing that ever happened to me." I raised an eyebrow. "Failure was the best thing?" He nodded. "Yeah. Because it made me human again." There was a heaviness in his tone, but also peace. Like someone who'd finally stopped running from his own reflection. He looked out across the park, where children were playing and sunlight spilled through the trees. "I wanted to say something," he said quietly. "Not as an apology this time. But as gratitude." I turned slightly. "Gratitude? You could have ruined me completely." But you didn't. You let me fall on my own. And that gave me the chance to rebuild the right way. For a long time, I didn't reply. Then I said, softly. Maybe we both needed to fall, to understand who we were without the masks. He smiled faintly. You've always had a way with words. We sat there for a while, two people who once stood on opposite sides of power, now just human. No anger. No resentment. Just understanding. Before leaving, he said, Anna, you were the best thing that ever happened to that company. I just wasn't smart enough to see it. I smiled gently. Sometimes people can't see the light when they're too used to standing in their own shadow. He nodded, almost smiling at the truth of it. Then he walked away, not with the arrogance of a man who thought he owned the world, but with the humility of someone who'd finally learned how to live in it. As I watched him disappear into the distance, I felt no triumph, no sting of revenge. Just peace. Because real closure doesn't come when they say sorry. It comes when you no longer need them to. That night, I wrote in my journal. I met him today. The man who once tried to silence me. But all I heard was my own voice, calm, steady, free. And beneath that, I wrote one last line. He laughed when I walked out. But the truth is, I never walked away from him. I walked back to myself. The next morning, the world felt lighter. The sunrise looked softer. And for the first time in a long time, I whispered to myself. You did it, Anna. You didn't just survive him. You became everything he said you couldn't be. And that, right there, that quiet, golden moment, was the sweetest revenge of all. Years later, when people hear my name, they don't remember the scandal. They don't think of the office politics, the betrayal, or even the man who once tried to take credit for my work. They remember the story. The woman who walked out. The woman who refused to stay silent. The woman who turned her pain into purpose. And that's exactly how I want it to be. My foundation grew beyond what I'd ever dreamed. We trained hundreds of women, women who once whispered their ideas but now speak them boldly. Women who no longer ask for a seat at the table. They build their own. Sometimes, they ask about my story. They want to know if I ever regret what happened. If I ever missed the life I left behind. And I always tell them the same thing. No. I don't regret walking away. Because I didn't lose anything that day. I only let go of what was never mine to carry. In time, I came to understand something that changed everything for me. Closure isn't a conversation. It's a decision. You don't need to hear "I'm sorry" to heal. You don't need them to understand to move on. You just need to look in the mirror one morning and say, it's over. I'm free. And then, you live like it's true. Now, when I walk into boardrooms filled with men in suits, I don't shrink anymore. I don't lower my voice. I don't wait for permission to be heard. I sit at the head of the table. Not because I fought my way there, but because I finally stopped asking for space that was always mine. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my office, I still think about that girl I used to be. The one who stayed late just to earn approval that never came. The one who cried silently in the bathroom and called it professionalism. The one who kept believing that being quiet meant being strong. If I could speak to her now, I'd take her hand and whisper. You're not too emotional. You're not too ambitious. You're not too much. You were just surrounded by people who were too little to see your worth. And I know she'd smile. Because deep down, she always knew she'd find her way back to herself. Sometimes, the stories that break us are the same ones that rebuild us. And sometimes, revenge doesn't come with anger. It comes with peace. With grace. With walking into your own future so completely. That your past no longer has a place to follow. The last time I ever spoke of Richard Harrison was in an interview. The reporter asked, if you could tell him one thing now, what would it be? I paused, smiled, and said, "Thank you for letting me go. Because without losing you, I never would have found me." And that became the quote they printed everywhere. The one that went viral. The one that made other women stop, think, and whisper, "Maybe it's time I walk away too." Because at the end of it all, he laughed when I quit. He laughed when I walked out. But one day, he had to sit down, open the news, and watch my name shine on the front page. Not as a victim, not as his assistant, but as the woman who turned her silence into a legacy. And I hope he smiled, too. Not from pride, but from understanding. That sometimes, the person you underestimated was never your downfall. She was your lesson. The end. White heavy checkmark tone summary for your voiceover. Calm, elegant, slightly slowed pacing, perfect for slow-mo voice effect. Emphasis on emotional pauses after every 2 to 3 lines. Best background, soft piano or cinematic ambient track. Perfect caption line. He laughed when I walked out, until the world started saying my name.